3 bullets to the chest. That's what Marco Salvatore promised anyone who dared speak his name with anything less than fear in their voice. But when the woman with honey-colored eyes sitting 2 tables ahead of him laughed and called him that scary Mafia guy, like he was nothing more than an urban legend, something inside his chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with anger. He leaned back in his leather booth at Carmelo's, the most exclusive restaurant in Lower Manhattan, and watched her through the dim candlelight as she gestured animatedly to her date, completely unaware that the man she was mocking could end her life with a single phone call. And yet, Marco found himself smiling, a dangerous, unfamiliar expression on a face that hadn't shown genuine emotion in over a decade. If you want to discover how a careless conversation in an Italian restaurant transformed a ruthless crime lord into a man who would burn the entire city down just to keep her safe, stay with this story until the end. Leave a like if you believe that even the darkest hearts can still feel something real. And tell me in the comments what you would do if you discovered the person you mocked was listening to every word. Your presence here means everything. The restaurant was one of Marco's legitimate businesses, though everyone in the neighborhood knew it was where he held court every Thursday evening. The red velvet curtains, the soft Italian opera playing from hidden speakers, the way the staff moved with military precision, all of it spoke of old money and older power. At 35, Marco had built an empire that stretched from the docks to the Diamond District, an empire his father had started, and that Marco had expanded with ruthless efficiency and strategic brutality. He wore his power like other men wore cologne, something invisible but unmistakable that made people step aside when he walked down the street. His tailored black suit was custom-made in Milan. His dark hair was swept back from a face that would have been handsome if not for the coldness in his steel-gray eyes, and his hands, currently wrapped around a glass of Barolo, had ended more lives than he cared to count. But tonight, those hands trembled slightly as he watched the woman 2 tables away, and Marco couldn't understand why. Her name was Elena Rossi, though he didn't know that yet. All he knew was that she had walked into his restaurant 45 minutes ago wearing a simple emerald green dress that clung to curves she seemed completely unaware of, her dark brown hair falling in waves down her back. And those eyes, those incredible honey-colored eyes that seemed to catch every flicker of candlelight and transform it into something magical. She was on a date with some corporate type in a cheap suit who kept checking his phone, and Marco had initially paid them no attention beyond the automatic threat assessment he performed on everyone who entered his space. But then he heard her laugh. It wasn't a polite laugh or a flirtatious giggle. It was genuine, full-throated, the kind of laugh that made other people smile just hearing it. And when Marco's most trusted lieutenant, Vincent, had walked past her table, and she'd grabbed her date's hand with sudden excitement, Marco found himself leaning forward despite himself. "Oh my God, Tony," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet restaurant, with an enthusiasm that suggested she'd had 2 glasses of wine too many. "Do you know who owns this place?" Tony, the corporate drone, barely looked up from his phone. "Some restaurant group, probably." "Why?" Elena leaned closer, her eyes wide with the kind of excitement people usually reserved for celebrity sightings. "No, seriously. My coworker told me this place is owned by that scary Mafia guy. You know, Marco Salvatore, the one everyone's always whispering about." Marco's hand stopped mid-reach for his wine glass. Vincent, who had been approaching Marco's table with the evening's reports, froze in place. The 2 bodyguards flanking the entrance shifted their weight, hands moving instinctively toward concealed weapons. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. But Elena, blissfully unaware that she was currently discussing the most dangerous man in New York, while he sat less than 20 feet behind her, continued with animated delight. Apparently, he's like a real crime boss, like Godfather stuff. Protection rackets, illegal gambling, all of it. She waved her hand dismissively, nearly knocking over her wine glass. I mean, come on. This is New York in 2024, not 1950s Sicily. The whole Mafia thing is so overdone, don't you think? It's probably just some rich guy who likes people thinking he's dangerous. You know, compensation for something. Tony finally looked up from his phone, but only to signal the waiter for the check. Can we not talk about organized crime on our first date, Elena? I'm just saying, Elena continued, apparently on a roll now, that the whole scary Mafia boss thing is kind of ridiculous. What's he going to do? Make me an offer I can't refuse? Please. I grew up in Brooklyn. I've seen actual scary. Some wannabe gangster who probably spends more time at the gym than actually doing crime? Not impressed. Marco should have been furious. He should have signaled to Vincent to have her removed, to teach her a lesson about respect, to demonstrate why people whispered his name with fear. Instead, he found himself captivated by her complete lack of fear, her dismissive attitude toward the reputation he'd spent years carefully cultivating. When was the last time someone had been unimpressed by him? When was the last time someone had laughed at the idea of him instead of trembling? She doesn't know, Vincent said quietly, appearing at Marco's side with the evening's reports forgotten. She actually doesn't know you're here. Marco's eyes never left Elena. He watched as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, as she smiled at something Tony said, as she glanced around the restaurant with open appreciation for the decor. She had no idea that every person in this room, from the hostess to the sommelier, answered to him. No idea that the staff was currently rigid with tension, waiting to see how he would respond to this unprecedented disrespect. Find out everything about her, Marco said softly. Everything. Vincent nodded and disappeared into the shadows. Marco continued watching as Elena's date finally succeeded in getting the check, clearly eager to end what was apparently not going well. Elena looked disappointed but not surprised, and there was something in her expression, a flash of resignation, of being used to disappointment, that made something dark and protective unfurl in Marco's chest. As they stood to leave, Elena's heel caught on the leg of her chair. She stumbled, and before Marco even realized he was moving, he was there, his hand catching her elbow, steadying her with a grip that was firm but surprisingly gentle. Careful, he said, his voice low and rough from years of shouting orders and making threats. Elena looked up at him, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Her honey-colored eyes widened as she took in his face, the sharp angles of his jaw, the intensity of his gaze, the expensive suit that screamed power and danger. Thank you, she breathed, and Marco could feel her pulse racing under his fingers where they still gripped her elbow. That would have been embarrassing. Falling is nothing to be embarrassed about, Marco replied, aware that every eye in the restaurant was now watching this interaction with barely concealed shock. Everyone stumbles sometimes. Tony appeared at Elena's side, his corporate instincts finally alerting him that something was off about this situation, about the way the tall, dark stranger was holding his date, about the sudden silence that had fallen over the restaurant. We should go, Tony said, reaching for Elena's other arm. Marco's eyes flicked to Tony's hand, then back to the man's face, and whatever Tony saw there made him step back immediately, his hand dropping to his side. It was a look Marco had perfected over years of silent intimidation, a promise of violence so clear it didn't need words. Of course, Marco said smoothly, releasing Elena's elbow, but letting his fingers trail down her forearm for just a moment longer than necessary. Have a pleasant evening. Elena smiled at him, a genuine warm smile that made her eyes crinkle at the corners, completely oblivious to the terror her date was currently experiencing. You too. And hey, beautiful restaurant. Whoever owns it has great taste. Marco's lips curved into something that might have been a smile if there had been any warmth in it. I'll be sure to pass along the compliment. As Elena and Tony hurried toward the exit, Elena turned back once, catching Marco's eye across the restaurant. She gave him a little wave, friendly and unself-conscious, before disappearing through the heavy oak doors into the Manhattan night. The silence that followed Elena's departure was absolute. Vincent appeared at Marco's side again, his expression carefully neutral in the way that meant he was deeply concerned. The bodyguards remained frozen by the entrance. The staff pretended to be busy, while clearly waiting for an explosion that everyone assumed was coming. Marco walked slowly back to his table, sat down, and picked up his wineglass with steady hands. He took a sip, savoring the complex notes of the Barolo, before setting the glass down with deliberate care. Her name, Marco said quietly, is Elena Rossi. I want her entire life history on my desk in 2 hours. Where she works, where she lives, who her friends are, what she eats for breakfast, everything. Vincent nodded, already typing into his phone. And the date? Tony? Leave him, Marco said dismissively. He's nobody. But I want to know why Elena Rossi was on a first date with someone who couldn't even pretend to be interested in her. Boss, Vincent said carefully, in the tone he used when he was about to say something Marco might not want to hear. She disrespected you. In your own restaurant. Everyone heard. Marco's eyes finally left the door where Elena had disappeared and fixed on Vincent with an intensity that made even his most loyal lieutenant take a half step back. She didn't disrespect me, Vincent. She doesn't know me. There's a difference. The men will talk. They'll say you're getting soft. A muscle ticked in Marco's jaw. Then the men can remember what happened to the last person who questioned my authority. Elena Rossi spoke carelessly because she doesn't live in our world. She doesn't know enough to be afraid. That's not disrespect. That's innocence. And anyone who touches her, anyone who even breathes near her without my explicit permission, will learn exactly how soft I am. Vincent wisely said nothing more, but Marco could see the calculation in his eyes, the concern. In their world, showing interest in a woman was showing weakness, and weakness got you killed. But Marco had been the king of this city's underworld for over a decade, precisely because he knew when to follow the rules and when to rewrite them entirely. 2 hours later, Marco sat in his study in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, reading through the file Vincent had compiled with his characteristic efficiency. Elena Rossi, 28 years old, elementary school teacher at a public school in Brooklyn. Grew up in Bay Ridge, daughter of a retired firefighter and a nurse. No siblings. Bachelor's degree in education from SUBO-NY. Graduated with honors despite working 2 jobs to pay for it. Currently lived in a small apartment in Sunset Park. Taught 3rd grade. Volunteered at a literacy program on weekends. No criminal record, not even a parking ticket. Her social media was full of pictures with her students, their faces carefully obscured, and captions about the joy of teaching. There were photos of her with friends at modest restaurants, at free concerts in the park, at movie nights that clearly happened in someone's living room. Her life was simple, genuine, full of small pleasures and meaningful connections. It was everything Marco's life wasn't. The file also included information about tonight's date. Tony Henderson, investment banker, serial first dater who ghosted women after determining they weren't executive wife material, whatever that meant. He'd taken Elena to Carmelo's specifically because he'd heard it was expensive and wanted to impress her, not knowing that the real power in that restaurant had nothing to do with the prices on the menu. Marco stared at Elena's photo, a candid shot from her school's website, where she was laughing at something off camera, her eyes bright with genuine joy. She looked nothing like the women who usually orbited his world, the ones who wore designer labels like armor and calculated every smile. Elena looked real, warm, alive in a way that made everything else seem like a pale imitation. His phone buzzed. Vincent. The teacher leaves her apartment at 6:45 every morning, walks to the subway, takes the R train to her school. She stops at the same coffee cart every day, orders the same thing. Black coffee. Everything bagel with cream cheese. She gets to school by 7:30, usually stays until 5. Thursday nights she has dinner with her father. Sundays she volunteers at the library. "You're having her followed," Marco said. It wasn't a question. "You said you wanted everything." Marco should have felt satisfied. Information was power, and now he had power over Elena Rossi. But instead, he felt something uncomfortably close to shame. She was a teacher who volunteered at libraries and had dinner with her father every Thursday. What was he doing invading her privacy, cataloging her routines, preparing to insert himself into her life like a disease? "Pull the surveillance," Marco said abruptly. "What?" Vincent's surprise was evident even through the phone. "You heard me. Pull it. I don't want her followed. I don't want her watched. I don't want her life documented like she's a target. Boss, I don't understand. 2 hours ago you wanted everything." Marco stood, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city he controlled. Somewhere out there, 20 stories below, Elena Rossi was probably grading papers or reading a book, completely unaware that a crime lord was having a crisis of conscience over her. "She called me a scary Mafia guy and laughed about it, Vincent. She has no idea who I am, what I do, the things I've done. And for the first time in my entire adult life, I don't want someone to know. I don't want her to look at me with fear. I don't want her to understand what my name means." There was a long pause. "That's going to be complicated, boss." "Everything worth having is complicated," Marco replied. "Now pull the surveillance and go home. I need to think." After Vincent hung up, Marco stood at the window for a long time, Elena's file still open on his desk behind him. He had built an empire on fear and violence, had become a monster so efficient at being monstrous that people whispered his name like a curse. He had everything money could buy and power could take. And none of it, not a single piece of it, had prepared him for what it felt like to be mocked by a woman with honey-colored eyes who didn't know enough to be afraid, who lived a life full of meaning and purpose and genuine laughter, who represented everything good that he had long ago decided he would never have. The city glittered below him, beautiful and corrupt, and his. But tomorrow morning, Elena Rossi would wake up in her small apartment in Sunset Park, drink her black coffee, eat her everything bagel, and teach children how to read. And she would do it all without ever knowing that she had just become the most dangerous obsession of the most dangerous man in New York. Marco Salvatore had conquered this city without mercy, but conquering the heart of a woman who didn't even know he existed? That was going to require a completely different strategy. He smiled in the darkness, a real smile this time, and it transformed his face into something almost human. Elena Rossi had no idea what was coming, but then again, neither did he. For the next 2 weeks, Marco did something he hadn't done in years. He waited. He didn't approach Elena, didn't orchestrate chance meetings, didn't use his considerable resources to insert himself into her life. Instead, he watched from a distance, not through hired surveillance, but through his own eyes. He found himself in Brooklyn more than he'd been in years, standing across the street from her school during dismissal, watching as she guided her students to their parents with a patience that seemed inexhaustible. He saw her stop to tie a child's shoe, saw her laugh when a little boy showed her a drawing, saw her stay late to talk to a worried mother about reading levels. He went to the coffee cart she frequented and ordered the same thing she did, black coffee and an everything bagel, trying to understand what she tasted every morning. The vendor, an older Dominican man, had looked at him with obvious suspicion. Men in $3,000 suits didn't usually buy dollar coffee from street carts. But Marco had handed over exact change and walked away without demanding respect or recognition, and the simple anonymity of it had been strangely liberating. He even drove past her apartment building one Thursday evening and saw her leaving with an older man who had to be her father, Roberto. They were laughing about something, her arm linked through his, and the easy affection between them made Marco's chest ache with an emotion he couldn't quite name. His own father had taught him how to intimidate, how to hurt, how to profit from others, fear. He had never taught Marco how to laugh with pure joy or show affection without calculation. Vincent thought he was losing his mind. The other lieutenants were starting to whisper. Marco Salvatore, the man who had consolidated 5 competing crime families into one ruthless empire, was spending his evenings in Brooklyn watching a schoolteacher. He should have been expanding into the new territory opening up in Queens. He should have been dealing with the Irish mob trying to move into his docks. Instead, he was learning Elena Rossi's favorite coffee order. But on the 15th day, something changed. Marco was in his usual spot across from the coffee cart, pretending to read a newspaper while Elena waited for her morning bagel, when he noticed 2 men watching her from a parked car. They weren't his men. He'd made sure all surveillance had been pulled. These were someone else's, and the way they watched her, with the focused intensity of professionals assessing a target, made every instinct Marco had developed over decades of survival scream in alarm. He recognized them within seconds. Dmitri's men. Russians. The Volkov family had been testing his boundaries lately, pushing into territory Marco had made clear was his. He'd been preparing a response, something brutal enough to remind Dmitri why the 5 families had fallen in line in the first place. But this, watching Elena, this was something else entirely. This was a message. They'd noticed his interest. They'd identified his weakness, and they were letting him know they could reach it whenever they wanted. Marco's vision narrowed to a single point of focus. The men in the car, the threat they represented, the violation of having Elena, innocent, unaware Elena, pulled into his world simply because he hadn't been able to stay away. He pulled out his phone, texted Vincent 3 words. "Volkov, handle it." Then he crossed the street. Elena was just receiving her coffee and bagel when Marco appeared beside her at the cart. She glanced up, startled, and for a moment he saw no recognition in her face. Then her eyes widened. "Oh, you're the guy from the restaurant, the one who caught me when I tripped." "Marco," he said, offering his hand. "And you're Elena, the woman who thinks Mafia bosses are overcompensating." He watched the color flood her cheeks, turning her skin a beautiful rose pink. Her mouth opened and closed twice before words came out. "Oh my God. You heard that? I am so sorry. I'd had wine, and I was nervous. And I have this terrible habit of talking too much when I'm nervous. And I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize," Marco said, and he was surprised to find he meant it. It was the most entertaining thing I'd heard in years. The vendor handed Elena her coffee, watching this interaction with interest. Elena clutched the cup like a lifeline, her honey-colored eyes searching Marco's face with a mixture of embarrassment and curiosity. "So you're not going to, have me killed? Have me? Or something?" She said it like a joke, but Marco could hear the tiny thread of real concern underneath. "For having an opinion?" "No." Marco took his own coffee from the vendor, handed over a 20, and waved off the change. "For having terrible taste in dates?" "Also no, though I question your judgment." Elena laughed, That same genuine, full-throated laugh he'd heard in the restaurant, and something in Marco's chest loosened. Tony was pretty awful, wasn't he? He spent the whole dinner on his phone. I should have just left. Why didn't you? Because I'm 28 and single, and my father keeps making sad faces about wanting grandchildren. And I thought maybe if I just tried harder, paid more attention, was more interesting. She trailed off, seeming to realize she was oversharing with a stranger. Sorry. You don't need my dating sob story. Marco wanted to tell her that Tony Henderson would never bother her again, that he'd already had Vincent and sure the man understood, that Elena Rossi was permanently off limits. He wanted to tell her that anyone who made her feel like she needed to be more interesting was an idiot who didn't deserve her time. Instead, he said, "Have dinner with me." Elena blinked. What? Dinner. Tonight. Somewhere where I promise to keep my phone off and actually pay attention to what you're saying. He could see her hesitation, the wariness that any smart woman would feel when a strange man asked her to dinner. I don't even know you. You know I own an Italian restaurant. You know I have good taste in decor. You know I can catch you when you fall. Marco smiled, and he saw her breath catch slightly. And you know I already find you interesting exactly as you are. She bit her lower lip, considering. Marco was aware of his men, now positioned around the block, watching the Russians watch Elena. He was aware that he was making her a target simply by standing here, by showing interest, by revealing that she mattered. The smart thing would be to walk away, to let her live her simple, safe life, teaching children and volunteering at libraries. But Marco Salvatore had built an empire by taking what he wanted and protecting it with ruthless efficiency. And he wanted Elena Rossi with an intensity that terrified him. One dinner, Elena finally said. Somewhere public, and I'm telling my father where I'm going and who I'm with. I wouldn't want it any other way, Marco replied. Give me your phone. She handed it over, and he typed in his number, then called himself, so he had hers. I'll pick you up at 7. Wear something comfortable. And Elena? She looked up at him with those incredible eyes. No more bad dates. If someone can't see how extraordinary you are in the first 5 minutes, they don't deserve the next 5. He walked away before she could respond, before he could do something stupid, like touch her face, or promise her things he had no business promising. As he slid into the back of his car, where Vincent was, waiting, he saw Elena still standing by the coffee cart, staring at her phone with a small smile on her face. The Russians? Marco asked. Taken care of, Vincent replied. They're being strongly encouraged to leave Brooklyn and never look in this direction again. Not good enough. I want Dmitri to know that Elena Rossi is under my protection. Anyone who even thinks about using her to get to me will face consequences that will make our previous disagreements look like friendly negotiations. Vincent pulled out his phone, already typing. You're starting a war over a woman you've had one 5-minute conversation with. No, Marco said, watching as Elena finally walked toward the subway, her coffee in one hand, her bagel in the other, completely unaware of the violence being orchestrated around her to keep her safe. I'm ending a war before it starts. Dmitri needs to understand that some lines, once crossed, can't be uncrossed. That evening, Marco stood outside Elena's apartment building at exactly 7 o'clock. He'd agonized over what to wear, finally settling on dark jeans and a black sweater under a wool coat, wanting to look approachable rather than intimidating. He'd also brought backup. 3 cars of his best men positioned on surrounding blocks, invisible but ready. Elena emerged from her building, wearing a simple rust-colored dress with boots, her hair loose around her shoulders, and Marco forgot how to breathe for a moment. She smiled when she saw him, nervous but genuine. I almost convinced myself you wouldn't show up. Why would I miss the chance to take the most interesting woman in New York to dinner? See, Flattery like that makes me suspicious, Elena said, but she was smiling. What do you want from me, Marco? Everything, he thought. Your laugh, your light, your ability to see good in a world I've spent my whole life learning is corrupt. Your innocence before I inevitably destroy it. Conversation, he said aloud, and maybe to prove that not all men are as oblivious as Tony. He'd chosen a small Italian place in the West Village, family-owned, nothing flashy. Somewhere Elena might actually feel comfortable rather than impressed. As they walked to his car, a simple black Mercedes, rather than the bulletproof SUV he usually traveled in, Elena glanced at him sideways. So, are you actually a Mafia boss, or was I completely wrong? Marco opened the car door for her. Would it matter? I don't know, she said honestly. Probably should. But you seem different than what I imagined. Different how? Scarier, she admitted. But also, I don't know. Sadder, maybe. Like you're carrying something heavy. She slid into the car, missing the way Marco's hands tightened on the doorframe. No one had ever looked at him and seen sadness. They saw power, danger, violence. But this woman, this school teacher who didn't know the first thing about his world, had seen through to the truth in 5 minutes. He was in so much trouble. And he didn't care at all. Dinner was unlike anything Marco had experienced in years. Elena asked questions, real questions, not the calculated queries of people trying to figure out how to use him. She wanted to know where he grew up, what his favorite food was, what he did when he couldn't sleep. Marco found himself editing carefully, removing the violence and crime from his stories, presenting a sanitized version of a life that was anything but clean. But the core truths remained. He told her about growing up in Little Italy, about a father who believed emotion was weakness, about learning early that the world was divided into those who took and those who were taken from. He told her about building something from nothing, about the satisfaction of creating order from chaos, carefully avoiding the methods he'd used. You're leaving something out, Elena said halfway through her pasta. Everyone has sanitized versions of their lives for first dates. Not like this. You're describing a business, but you're not describing your life. Where are your friends? Your family? What do you do for fun? Marco took a sip of wine, considering. I don't have friends. I have associates. My father is dead. My mother left when I was 7. And fun? He smiled without humor. I work. That's what I do. Elena's expression softened with something that looked dangerously like compassion. That sounds incredibly lonely. It's practical. Emotions make you vulnerable. Vulnerability gets you hurt. Or, Elena said gently, vulnerability gets you connected, gets you relationships that matter, gets you moments like this, where you sit across from someone and actually talk about real things. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Being alone might feel safe, Marco, but it's not the same as being protected. Her touch was warm, her hand small against his, and Marco stared at their joined hands as if he'd never seen such a thing before. When was the last time someone had touched him without fear or calculation? When was the last time someone had offered comfort instead of asking for favors? You're very wise for a third-grade teacher, he managed. Third graders teach you a lot about human nature, Elena replied. They haven't learned to hide their feelings yet. When they're sad, they cry. When they're happy, they laugh. When they care about someone, they show it without worrying about looking weak. Adults could learn a lot from them. Is that why you teach? To stay connected to that honesty? Partly. Also because someone needs to care about these kids. A lot of them come from difficult situations. Poverty, unstable homes, parents who are too overwhelmed to be present. If I can be one stable, caring presence in their lives, If I can show them that they matter, that they're worth someone's time and attention, maybe that changes their trajectory. The passion in her voice, the genuine care for children she spent her days with, made something crack in the careful walls Marco had built around his heart. Elena Rossi wasn't just beautiful or interesting. She was good, truly good, in a way that had nothing to do with naivety and everything to do with choice. She saw the darkness in the world and chose to bring light anyway. "You're staring," Elena said softly, color rising in her cheeks again. "You're worth staring at." Marco meant it in ways that had nothing to do with her physical beauty. "You have this way of making everything seem possible. Like goodness and kindness aren't just survival strategies, but actual values worth living by. You say that like you don't believe it. I'm not sure I do. I've seen what happens to good people in this world, Elena. They get used. They get hurt. They end up as collateral damage in other people's wars. Or," she countered, "they change the world around them. One person at a time. One kind act at a time. One moment of genuine connection at a time. The world is dark because people choose darkness, Marco. But it could be different if enough people chose light instead." It was such a simple philosophy, so idealistic it should have been laughable. But sitting across from Elena, watching the conviction in her honey-colored eyes, Marco found himself wanting to believe, wanting to think that maybe his choices weren't predetermined by his father's legacy, that maybe there was a version of his life that included this kind of goodness. After dinner, Marco walked Elena back to his car, hyper-aware of his men positioned around them, of the security he'd arranged, of the very real dangers that came with being close to him. He should tell her. He should explain exactly who he was, what he did, the blood on his hands. But the words wouldn't come. "I had a really nice time," Elena said as they reached her apartment building. "Much better than the restaurant date where I mocked you without knowing you were there." "I should probably confess something," Marco said. "I did hear everything you said that night, about me being overcompensating and the Mafia being ridiculous." Elena groaned, covering her face with her hands. "Please don't remind me. I'm never drinking wine on first dates again. Don't be embarrassed. You were right." She peeked at him through her fingers. "About which part?" "All of it. The Mafia is ridiculous. Men who build their identities on fear and violence are compensating for something. And the whole scary crime boss thing is overdone." He stepped closer, watching her eyes widen. "But here's what you didn't know, Elena. Some of us are scary because we've had to be. Some of us compensate because we never learned any other way to feel powerful. And some of us are so overdone playing a role that we forget there might be any other option." Her hands fell away from her face. "Marco, what are you trying to tell me? That you were right to be unimpressed. That whoever Marco Salvatore is in the world's eyes, he's not someone worthy of someone like you. But maybe, for the first time in my life, I want to try to be." He should have left it there, should have said goodnight and walked away. But Elena was looking at him with those eyes full of understanding and possibility, and Marco found himself reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, just as he'd imagined doing 1,000 times. His fingers lingered on her cheek. "You're shaking," Elena whispered. "You terrify me," Marco admitted. "You and your philosophy about choosing light, and your belief that people can change, and your ability to see through every defense I've ever built. You terrify me because you make me want things I have no business wanting." "What things?" "A life that's more than just survival. Moments that matter. The ability to look at myself and see something other than a monster." He should stop talking. This was too much honesty, too much vulnerability. But Elena's hand had come up to cover his, where it still rested against her cheek, and her touch was breaking down every carefully constructed barrier. I don't see a monster, Elena said softly. I see a man who's been hurt. A man who built walls to protect himself. A man who maybe, possibly, could let someone in if he was brave enough to try. Brave, Marco repeated with a bitter laugh. I've done a lot of things, Elena, but brave isn't one of them. Ruthless, yes. Strategic, absolutely. But actually brave enough to risk feeling something real? That's a different kind of courage. Then maybe we're both trying something new, she said. Because trusting a man I barely know, who admits to being involved in things I probably don't want to know about, who makes my pulse race and my better judgment scream warnings, that takes courage too. Marco knew he should clarify exactly what he was involved in, should give her the full truth so she could make an informed choice. But the words stuck in his throat, trapped by selfishness and fear and the desperate desire to have this one good thing before she inevitably ran from what he really was. Instead, he leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and brushed his lips against hers. It was meant to be gentle, brief, a question more than a statement. But the moment their mouths met, something ignited. Elena's hand slid into his hair, pulling him closer. Marco's arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her slightly as he deepened the kiss, tasting her, memorizing her, trying to pour everything he couldn't say into this single moment of connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elena's eyes were wide and slightly dazed. That was dangerous, Marco finished. Stupid, selfish of me. I was going to say amazing, Elena said. But sure, we can go with your words too. She smiled, that beautiful, genuine smile that transformed her entire face. Same time tomorrow. Tomorrow? You're not getting rid of me that easily, scary Mafia guy. You promised me interesting, and so far, you're delivering. Plus, I want to know more about this man who thinks he's a monster, but kisses like he's trying to save us both. Marco's heart, that organ he'd thought was long dead, seemed to restart in his chest. Tomorrow. But Elena, yes? When you learn the truth about who I am, about what I've done, promise me you'll remember this moment. Remember that whatever else is true, this was real. She looked confused by the intensity in his voice, but she nodded. I promise. The next 3 weeks existed in a strange bubble outside of reality. Marco found himself living 2 separate lives. By day, he was still Marco Salvatore, crime lord, businessman, the man whose word was law in 5 boroughs. He dealt with territorial disputes, money laundering operations, and the constant low-level warfare that came with controlling an empire built on illegal foundations. He made decisions that affected hundreds of lives, signed off on operations that existed in legal gray areas at best, and maintained the reputation that kept his world in order. But by night, he became someone else entirely. Someone who picked Elena up from school, who listened to stories about her students with genuine interest, who learned the difference between whole language and phonics instruction because it mattered to her. Someone who held her hand while they walked through Central Park, who kissed her goodnight outside her apartment with a tenderness he didn't know he possessed, who fell asleep thinking about the sound of her laugh instead of the weight of his empire. Vincent watched this transformation with growing concern. Boss, we need to talk about the Volkov situation. Dmitri is getting bold again. He's moving product through the ports without permission, and the men are saying we need to respond. Marco was getting ready for dinner with Elena, checking his reflection to make sure no blood or violence clung to his clothes. Handle it. Make an example that's clear, but not excessive. And Vincent? Make sure it doesn't touch Elena's world. No violence in Brooklyn, nothing near her school, nothing that could possibly circle back to her. That's getting harder to guarantee. People are noticing your interest. They're asking questions. Then make sure the answers they get emphasize exactly how much I value my privacy and how poorly I respond to people who violate it. Marco turned from the mirror. Elena is off limits, not just to our enemies, but to our people too. No one approaches her, no one investigates her, no one uses her as leverage. Spread the word. And when she figures out what you are, Vincent asked. Because she will, boss. Women like that. They're not stupid. She's going to ask questions eventually. Then I'll answer them, Marco said, though his stomach twisted at the thought. But until she asks, I'm going to have this, whatever this is, for as long as it lasts. It lasted longer than he expected. Elena seemed content to exist in their bubble too, not pushing for details about his work, focusing instead on the person he was with her. She introduced him to her world, dragging him to school fundraisers, where he wrote checks that made the PTA president nearly faint, to Sunday dinners with her father, where Roberto Rossi treated him with the same straightforward respect he showed everyone, to volunteer days at the library, where Marco found himself reading to children for the first time in his life. You're good with them, Elena said, watching as Marco finished a picture book about a dragon who was afraid of his own fire. The children were sitting in a semicircle around him, completely enthralled, and Marco realized with surprise that he enjoyed this. The simplicity of it, the way the kids just accepted him as another adult reading them a story, no fear or calculation in their eyes. They're easy to be good with. They don't expect anything except attention and honesty. That's all anyone really wants, Elena replied. It's just that adults learn to hide that need under layers of protection and pretense. She took his hand as they walked out of the library. I like that you're not pretending with me, Marco. I like seeing the real you. Guilt twisted in his stomach because he was pretending, just in a different way. He was showing her a real part of himself, but hiding the other parts, the darker parts, the violence and crime that funded his lifestyle and gave him the freedom to spend every evening with her. Elena, he started, but she squeezed his hand. I know you have things you're not telling me. I'm not stupid. Men don't have your kind of money and influence from legitimate businesses alone, not in New York, not at your age. But I also know that people are complicated, that you can be more than one thing at once, and I trust that when you're ready, you'll tell me the truth. It should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like a countdown timer had just started. 1 month into their relationship, on a cold December evening, Elena invited Marco to her school's holiday concert. He sat in a tiny chair meant for third graders, his knees nearly to his chest, watching as Elena's students performed songs about snowflakes and reindeer with varying degrees of accuracy and enthusiasm. Elena caught his eye from where she stood at the side of the stage, mouthing sorry about the small chair, and Marco found himself grinning genuinely for maybe the first time in decades. Afterward, as they walked to his car through the first snowfall of the season, Elena stopped suddenly. What is it? Marco asked, immediately scanning for threats, his body tensing. Nothing bad. Just... She turned to face him, snowflakes catching in her hair, transforming her into something magical in the streetlight. I'm falling in love with you. I know it's too soon to say that. I know we've only known each other 5 weeks, but I needed you to know. Because whatever complicated things you're involved in, whatever truths you're going to tell me eventually, I need you to know that this is real for me. Marco's chest felt too tight. Elena, you don't have to say it back. I'm not expecting that. I just needed to be honest because that's what we do. We're honest with each other, even when it's scary. But Marco pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight he was probably hurting her, though she didn't complain. I love you, he said into her hair, the words torn from somewhere deep inside him. I love you, and I'm terrified of it. I'm terrified because I don't deserve you. Because my love comes with darkness you can't imagine. Because loving me might destroy you." Elena pulled back to look at his face. "Then let me decide. Tell me the truth, Marco. All of it. Let me choose with full knowledge instead of partial information." This was it. The moment he'd been dreading and knowing was inevitable. Marco took a deep breath. "Not here. Come to my place. I'll tell you everything. And then you can decide if you still want anything to do with me." The drive to his penthouse was silent. Elena held his hand, her thumb tracing small circles on his palm, and Marco memorized the feeling because he was certain it would be the last time she touched him willingly. In his apartment, with the city sprawled below them like a carpet of lights, Marco poured them both whiskey and began to talk. He told her about his father, about being raised in the life, about the first time he'd witnessed violence at age 7, when his father had beaten a man nearly to death in their living room for late payment. He told her about his first kill at 17, a rival family member who'd threatened his father, how his hands had shaken and his father had called him weak. He told her about building his empire after his father's death, about the bodies that paved his path to power, about the fear he'd cultivated as carefully as other men cultivated gardens. He told her about protection rackets and money laundering, about the ports he controlled and the politicians he owned, about the careful balance of violence and diplomacy that kept his world spinning. He didn't spare himself, didn't paint it as necessary evil or complicated morality. He just gave her the truth, raw and ugly, and watched as her face went from shocked to horrified, to something he couldn't quite read. When he finished, the silence stretched like broken glass. "Say something," Marco finally said, his voice rough. Elena set down her untouched whiskey with trembling hands. "You're telling me you've killed people. Multiple people." "Yes." "You run criminal operations throughout the city." "Yes." "The money you've donated to my school, the gifts you've given me, all of it comes from illegal activities." "Yes." She stood abruptly, walking to the window, her arms wrapped around herself. Marco stayed where he was, giving her space, his heart hammering with the certainty that he was about to lose the only good thing he'd had in years. "I should leave," Elena said softly. "You should," Marco agreed. "You should run as far from me as possible and never look back. But I don't want to." She turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. "And I hate that. I hate that knowing all of this, knowing what you've done. I still love you. What does that say about me?" "It says you see something in me that isn't there, some potential for redemption that doesn't exist. Or it says that people are complicated, that you can be a man who's done terrible things, and also a man who reads to children at the library, that you can be someone shaped by violence and trauma and still be capable of tenderness and love." She walked back to him, stopping just out of reach. "I'm not saying I'm okay with what you do. I'm not saying I condone it or accept it. But I am saying that I love the man you are with me, and I believe that man is real, not a performance. Elena, you don't understand what being with me means. The danger, the compromises, the reality that you'll be loving someone whose hands have blood on them that will never wash off. Then help me understand, not by telling me why I should leave, but by showing me who you want to be. You said I made you want things you had no business wanting. What do you want, Marco?" The question hung in the air between them. What did he want? He wanted her, obviously. But more than that, he wanted to be the man she saw when she looked at him. He wanted to build something that didn't require violence to maintain. He wanted to wake up without the weight of his empire crushing him. He wanted a life. "I want out," he heard himself say. "I want to find a way to leave this world without getting myself or everyone I care about killed in the process. I want to build something legitimate. Something that doesn't require fear and blood to sustain. I want to be someone you could be proud of instead of ashamed of." "I'm not ashamed of you," Elena said. "I'm heartbroken by what was done to you, by the childhood that made you think violence was the only language worth speaking. But I'm not ashamed. And if you really want out, if you really want to change, then I'll help you figure out how. You don't know what you're offering." "No, I probably don't. But I know that everyone deserves the chance to choose a different path. I know that change is possible when someone actually wants it. And I know that I love you enough to try." Marco crossed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, shaking with emotions he couldn't name. "I don't deserve you." "Probably not," Elena agreed, her arms tight around his waist. "But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is what we choose to do next. Together." The next 6 months were the most challenging of Marco's life, and he'd lived a life defined by challenges. Getting out of the criminal empire he'd built wasn't as simple as walking away. There were obligations, threats, power vacuums to manage, and the very real risk that attempting to leave would be seen as weakness by people who were always looking for opportunities to take what he had. But Marco was strategic. He began slowly, carefully, moving legitimate money into legal businesses, selling off the more violent aspects of his operations to people he trusted to maintain the balance of power without starting wars. He invested heavily in real estate development, in restaurants, in security companies that operated entirely above board. It was a 5-year plan minimum, Vincent told him, assuming everything went perfectly. And things rarely went perfectly in their world. Elena became his anchor through it all. On the nights when the guilt of his past actions threatened to drown him, when he wondered if redemption was even possible for someone with his history, she reminded him why he was doing this, not just for her, but for himself, for the chance to become someone who could look at his reflection and feel something other than disgust. She also set boundaries, clear ones, and Marco respected her for it. She wouldn't come to his business meetings, wouldn't meet his associates beyond Vincent, who she'd insisted on meeting specifically so she could tell him that if anything happened to Marco during this transition, she'd hold Vincent personally responsible. Vincent had looked terrified and impressed in equal measure. She wouldn't accept gifts that came from illegal money, wouldn't let Marco use his connections to fix problems in her life. "I fell in love with you, not your power," she told him when he tried to resolve a funding issue at her school through his contacts. "And if we're going to do this, if we're going to build a real relationship, it has to be based on who we actually are, not what you can do for me." It was humbling and infuriating, and exactly what Marco needed. Roberto Rossi had been harder to win over than Elena. The older man had looked at Marco with the practiced skepticism of someone who'd lived in Brooklyn his whole life and knew exactly what men like Marco represented. "My daughter tells me you're trying to change," Roberto said over their 5th Thursday dinner together, after Elena had gone to the kitchen to help her mother with dessert. "That you want out of whatever you've been doing." "I am," Marco confirmed. "It's not fast, and it's not simple. But I'm working on it." "Why?" Roberto's eyes were sharp. "Because Elena asked? Because you think it'll make her happy?" "Because I want to be someone worthy of her. Because I'm tired of the person I've been. Because for the first time in my life, I can see an alternative. And I want it badly enough to risk everything to get it." Roberto studied him for a long moment. "My daughter is the best thing that ever happened to my life. Her mother and I tried for years to have children, went through loss after loss. When Elena finally came, healthy and perfect, it felt like a miracle. We raised her to be strong, to be kind, to believe in people's capacity for good. She's everything bright in a world that's often dark." "I know," Marco said quietly. That's why I don't deserve her. But I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to become someone who does." "See that you do," Roberto replied. "Because if you hurt her, if you bring your old world into her life and destroy that light she carries, there isn't a place you can hide that I won't find you. I might be an old man, but I protected this city for 30 years as a firefighter. I know how to handle dangerous situations." It should have been a laughable threat. Roberto Rossi was in his 60s, retired, with none of the resources or violence Marco could command. But the look in the old man's eyes, the fierce paternal protection, made Marco nod seriously. "I won't hurt her. Not if I can help it." Then we understand each other. The real test came on a winter evening 7 months after Marco had started his exit strategy. He and Elena were having dinner at his penthouse when Vincent called with an emergency. "It's Dimitri. He's made a move. He's taken 3 of our warehouses and is demanding a meeting. He says if you're really leaving the life, now's the time for him to take what you're giving up." Marco's jaw tightened. This was exactly what he'd been trying to avoid. A power play that would force him to respond with violence or look weak. "I'll handle it." "Marco," Elena said as he hung up. "What's wrong?" He could lie, could tell her it was a business issue with one of his legitimate companies. But they'd promised honesty. "Someone from my old world is testing me, seeing if my transition makes me vulnerable." "Are you vulnerable?" Marco considered. "By old standards, yes. I'm not willing to respond with the same level of violence I would have before. But that doesn't mean I'm defenseless." "What are you going to do?" "Talk to him. Make it clear that leaving the life doesn't mean I've forgotten how it works, or that I can't still protect what's mine if necessary." Elena bit her lower lip. "This is the part I struggle with. Knowing that you still have to operate in that world, even as you're trying to leave it. That violence is still an option for you. I know. And if you want to leave, if this is too much—" "Stop," she interrupted. "Stop offering me exits. I'm not leaving. I'm scared. And I hate that you still have to deal with this, but I'm not leaving. Just promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll try the diplomatic approach first." Marco pulled her into his arms. "I promise. Violence is a last resort now. I have too much to lose." The meeting with Dimitri took place in neutral territory, a private room, in a restaurant that neither of them controlled. Marco brought Vincent and 2 other men. Dimitri brought a small army, a clear message about how he viewed Marco's changing position. "Marco Salvatore," Dimitri said, his Russian accent thick. "I hear you're becoming a legitimate businessman. How very American dream of you." "Dimitri, hear you're making moves in my territory. How very suicidal of you." The Russian laughed. "Your territory? You're leaving. Everyone knows it. Why should I respect borders drawn by a man who's no longer willing to enforce them? Because leaving the life doesn't mean I've lost the ability to operate in it," Marco said calmly. "It just means I choose not to, unless absolutely necessary. Don't mistake evolution for weakness." Pretty words. But words don't hold territory. Fear does. Violence does. And you're not willing to use either anymore. "You're wrong," Marco leaned forward. "I'm not willing to use them casually anymore. But you taking my warehouses? That's not casual. That's a direct challenge. So let me be clear. You have 24 hours to return what you took and retreat to your territory. If you do, we pretend this misunderstanding never happened. If you don't—" "If I don't?" Dimitri challenged. Marco smiled, and it was the smile that had made men confess secrets, just to make it stop. "Then you'll learn the difference between a man who's left the life and a man who's simply refined his approach. I have lawyers now, Dimitri, investigators, access to financial records and shipping manifests. I know about your operations in Brighton Beach. about the very illegal nature of your import business. I know which politicians you've bribed and which cops you've bought. And I have the resources to make all of that information very public, very quickly. Dimitri's face paled slightly. You would destroy both of us. No, I've already cleaned my operations. Anything that comes out about me now, I can weather. You, on the other hand, are still operating entirely in the shadows. How long do you think you last when those shadows disappear? The silence that followed was heavy. Finally, Dimitri nodded. 24 hours. You'll have your warehouses back. Good. And Dimitri? Tell the others. Marco Salvatore is leaving the life, but he's not defenseless. Anyone who treats my transition as an opportunity will find that I've simply changed weapons, not lost them. Walking out of that meeting, Vincent let out a breath. That was either brilliant or you just made yourself a bigger target. Maybe both, Marco admitted. But I kept my promise to Elena. Diplomacy first, violence as a last resort. And it worked. This time. What about next time? Next time, I'll be further out, more legitimate, less vulnerable. And eventually, I'll be so far removed from this world that the next times, we'll stop coming. It was optimistic, maybe even naive. But with Elena waiting for him at home, with a future that looked different from his past, finally within reach, Marco chose to believe it was possible. When he got back to the penthouse, Elena was curled up on the couch reading papers from her students. She looked up when he entered, her eyes searching his face for signs of violence or trouble. I'm okay, he said immediately. It's handled, diplomatically. The relief in her expression made his chest ache. I'm proud of you. Don't be. Not yet. I'm still the same person who built an empire on fear. One diplomatic solution doesn't erase that. Elena set down her papers and stood, crossing to him. No, but it's a start. And starts are important. They're where change begins. She reached up to cup his face. You know what one of my students said today? I was teaching them about metamorphosis, about how caterpillars become butterflies. And this little girl asked if the butterfly remembers being a caterpillar. I said I didn't know, but I hoped so, because remembering where we came from helps us appreciate where we are. Profound for a third grader. They usually are. Elena smiled. My point is, you don't have to erase who you were, Marco. You just have to choose who you're becoming. And I see you choosing. Every day, I see you choosing to be different, better. That matters. Marco kissed her then, pouring everything he felt into it. Gratitude, love, hope, fear, all of it tangled together in a way that should have been overwhelming, but instead felt like coming home. Marry me, he said when they broke apart. Elena blinked. What? Marry me. I know it's too soon. I know I'm still transitioning out of a life you never wanted to be part of. I know there are 1,000 reasons to say no. But I love you, and I want to build a future with you, and I don't want to waste time pretending I don't want forever with you. Marco, you don't have to answer now. Think about it. Take all the time you need. But know that I'm serious. Know that when I picture my future, every version of it has you in it. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. Yes, 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 I'll marry you. Because you're right. Every version of my future has you in it too. The you that's trying, that's changing, that's brave enough to walk away from everything you built because you want to be better. That's the man I want to spend my life with. Marco pulled the ring box from his pocket, the one he'd been carrying for 2 weeks waiting for the right moment. Inside was a simple diamond, elegant, nothing ostentatious. It's perfect, Elena whispered as he slid it onto her finger. Like you. They spent the rest of the night planning a future that felt impossible and inevitable at once, talking about the life they'd build together, the family they might have, the ordinary, extraordinary existence that awaited them on the other side of Marco's transition. And for the first time since he was 7 years old, Marco Salvatore believed in happy endings. The wedding took place 18 months later, after Marco had successfully extricated himself from the worst of his criminal enterprises and established enough legitimate businesses that he could honestly tell Elena's students' parents he was a real estate developer without lying. It was small, intimate, held in the same Brooklyn church where Elena had been baptized. Roberto walked her down the aisle, while Maria cried in the front row. Vincent stood as Marco's best man, looking uncomfortable in his tuxedo, but present nonetheless, a testament to his loyalty that extended beyond business. As Elena walked toward him in a simple white dress that made her look ethereal in the afternoon light streaming through stained glass windows, Marco felt something inside him finally settle. This was what being chosen felt like, not through fear or obligation or calculation, but through genuine love and acceptance. "You look terrified," Elena whispered when she reached him. "I am," Marco admitted quietly. "Terrified that I'll wake up, and this will be a dream. Terrified that I don't deserve this. Terrified that somehow my past will still destroy our future." "Then it's a good thing terror doesn't mean you're doing the wrong thing," she replied. "Sometimes it just means you're doing something that matters." The ceremony was traditional, full of promises about sickness and health, better and worse, richer and poorer. When the priest asked if anyone objected, Marco tensed, half expecting someone from his old life to appear with demands or threats. But there was only silence, and then Elena's hand squeezing his, reminding him that his old life didn't get to intrude on this moment. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the priest said, and when Marco kissed Elena, he tasted salt from her tears and sweetness from her smile, and he thought maybe redemption was possible after all. The reception was held at a small Italian restaurant in the neighborhood, nothing like the opulent venues Marco could have afforded, but it was filled with people who mattered. Elena's teacher friends, her father's firefighter buddies, some of Marco's legitimate business associates, and the small number of people from his old life who'd supported his transition. Vincent gave a speech that managed to be both heartfelt and carefully edited, talking about how he'd watched his boss become a better man through love, without mentioning what exactly Marco was becoming better from. Roberto spoke about trusting his daughter's judgment, while making eye contact with Marco in a way that clearly communicated the threat still stood if Marco ever hurt her. As the night wound down and guests began leaving, Marco found himself outside in the restaurant's small courtyard garden with Vincent. "You did it," Vincent said, lighting a cigarette. "Actually pulled off the impossible." "Haven't pulled anything off yet. I'm still vulnerable. Still have enemies who might decide a retired Marco Salvatore is an easy target. But you have something worth protecting now. That's different from just surviving." Vincent looked at him seriously. "For what it's worth, boss, I think you made the right choice. You were good at what we did, the best I ever saw. But you were also miserable. Now, you're actually living. I'm terrified every day that I'll lose this, that some consequence from my past will catch up and destroy everything. Then you protect it the way you protected your territory, with everything you have, just with different tools." Vincent stubbed out his cigarette. "Elena's good for you. She makes you human again. Don't lose sight of that." Inside, Marco found Elena talking with her father, both of them laughing about something. She looked up when he approached, her smile transforming into something private and intimate that was just for him. "Ready to start our life?" she asked. "More than ready." They drove to Marco's penthouse, their penthouse now, and as the city lights blurred past the windows, Elena rested her head on his shoulder. "I have a confession," she said. "What's that?" "The night at Carmelo's. When I called you a scary Mafia guy, I kinda hoped you'd heard me." Marco pulled back to look at her. "What?" Elena's cheeks flushed pink. "I'd seen you before, at the coffee cart. You stood out, and not just because of the expensive suit. There was something about you, something intense and lonely and compelling. When Tony took me to your restaurant, I recognized you sitting in the corner, and I wanted you to notice me, so I said something outrageous hoping you'd hear. You manipulated me?" Marco wasn't sure whether to be impressed or insulted. "I got your attention," Elena corrected. "The rest was real. My feelings, our connection, all of it. But that first moment, I might have engineered it a tiny bit." Marco laughed, genuinely laughed, at the absurdity and perfection of it. So the woman who doesn't believe in manipulation actually manipulated a crime lord into falling in love with her. "Reformed crime lord," Elena corrected, "and I prefer to think of it as strategic honesty. I honestly thought the Mafia thing was overdone. I honestly wanted you to notice me. I just combined those two things in a way that worked." "You're dangerous," Marco said admiringly. "You're absolutely dangerous, and I had no idea." "Everyone has their methods," Elena replied with a smile. "Mine just happened to involve honest observations delivered at calculated volumes." At the penthouse, Elena walked to the windows overlooking the city, the same windows where Marco had stood months ago, trying to figure out how to protect her from his world. "Tell me something," she said. "Anything. What happens now?" "Really? Do we just live happily ever after and pretend your past doesn't exist?" Marco came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "No. My past will always exist. There will always be consequences, always threats, always the reality of who I was. But we face them together. And slowly, over time, the distance between who I was and who I'm becoming gets bigger. Until eventually, the past is just history, not current events. And if someone from that past shows up, if there's a crisis, then I handle it. But not alone anymore. Not without considering you, considering us, considering the life we're building. You're my priority now, Elena. Everything else is secondary." She turned in his arms, looking up at him with those honey-colored eyes that had changed everything. "I love you. The you that reads to children at the library, and the you that can stare down Russian mobsters. The you that's trying to change, and the you that's accepting who you were. All of it." "I love you," Marco replied. "You saved me, Elena. You saw something worth saving when I'd given up on myself." "We saved each other," she corrected. "I was living a good life, but a small one. Safe, contained. You showed me that taking risks, choosing love even when it's complicated, that's where real living happens." They stood there together, two people who'd found each other against all odds, looking out at a city that had witnessed their entire journey. From that first night at Carmelo's, when Elena had unknowingly mocked the most dangerous man in New York, to this moment, married and building a future that neither of them could have imagined. "Hey, Marco," Elena said softly. "Yes?" "Thank you for sitting behind me that night. Thank you for not having me killed for disrespecting you." Marco laughed into her hair. "Thank you for being worth changing for being brave enough to love someone like me, for believing in redemption when you had every reason not to." "Always," Elena promised. And in that moment, overlooking the city that had shaped them both, Marco Salvatore finally understood what he'd been searching for his entire life. Not power or fear or control. Just this. Love that was real and complicated and chosen every single day. The kind of love that transformed scary Mafia guys into men who believed in second chances, who read to children, who understood that true strength wasn't about how much fear you could inspire, but how much courage you had to be vulnerable. Sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't violence or crime or building empires on fear. Sometimes the most dangerous thing is opening your heart to someone who sees through all your defenses and loves you anyway. Marco had spent his life being dangerous in one way. Now, with Elena's hand in his and their future stretching out before them, he was learning to be dangerous in an entirely different way. The kind of dangerous that changes lives, that builds families, that proves even the darkest pasts can lead to bright futures if you're willing to do the work of transformation. And it all started because a woman with honey-colored eyes had mocked him in his own restaurant, not knowing he was listening, giving him the first genuine moment he'd had in years. If you believe that even the hardest hearts can soften, that change is possible when love gives us a reason, that our pasts don't have to define our futures. Subscribe now and become part of this community. Leave a like if this story touched something in you, and tell me in the comments about a time when someone saw potential in you that you didn't see in yourself. Your presence here, your engagement, it matters more than you know. And if you want early access to stories like this, stories about real transformation and complicated love, consider becoming a member or clicking the Super Thanks button. Every gesture helps us continue bringing you narratives about hope, redemption, and the power of choosing to be better. Because at the end of the day, we're all just looking for someone who sees us truly and loves us anyway. Someone who believes we can change. Someone who makes us want to be worthy of their faith in us. Elena gave that to Marco. And maybe, just maybe, there's someone out there who can give that to each of us too. We just have to be brave enough to let them in.